The war was over, but the aftermath was anything but peaceful. Across the world, military surplus from World War II sat unused, an overwhelming burden. Tens of thousands of tanks, planes, and ships, once essential for victory, now stood idle, rusting in fields and harbors. Nations faced a difficult question: how could they rid themselves of this massive stockpile? Destruction seemed wasteful, but storing or selling it presented other problems. The world was rebuilding, but the remnants of war posed a quiet, lingering reminder of the immense cost of victory. What was to become of the weapons that had shaped the war? And what would be lost in the process? The war was over, but the work had only just begun. In Europe, as in the Pacific, the end of World War II did not signal a peaceful new dawn for the Allies. It marked the beginning of an unprecedented challenge: what to do with the colossal surplus of weapons that had been stockpiled for the fight. Ships, tanks, artillery, and planes, hundreds of thousands of pieces of machinery once forged for destruction, now abandoned to face a very different fate. The question echoed in government offices, military depots, and scrap yards across the globe: how would they rid themselves of this immense, unnecessary burden? And, more chillingly, what were they about to lose in the process? In the immediate aftermath of the war, Allied nations faced a staggering dilemma. The sheer volume of surplus weapons, produced at the peak of wartime desperation, was, in itself, a logistical nightmare. The United States, for example, had produced 296,000 aircraft alone between 1940 and 1945. With the war over, production ceased almost overnight, and the facilities that had once roared with activity fell eerily silent. On the ground, thousands of military vehicles, jeeps, trucks, and armored cars were parked, collecting rust as soldiers returned home. The weapons, no longer needed for active defense, were now symbols of excess. The war had drained national economies. Reconstruction was the priority now, and every pound, every dollar had to be accounted for. In Britain, for instance, the cost of maintaining an overstocked military was simply too great. With a national debt swelling to over £3 billion, and the country facing the task of rebuilding war-torn cities, it was clear that resources needed to be allocated elsewhere. The Allied powers found themselves teetering on the edge of bankruptcy, and they could no longer afford to maintain vast military inventories that served no purpose in a peaceable world. But disposal would not be as simple as pressing a button or signing a decree. It took months, sometimes years, before even basic decisions could be made. The dilemma was clear: to dispose of these weapons was to acknowledge that the war was truly over. But doing so could also mean confronting uncomfortable truths about the enormous scale of destruction that had been unleashed, and what would be lost when these tools of war were forgotten. Would these weapons be wiped from memory, or would they become monuments to the past, existing as mute witnesses to the immense cost of victory? By the summer of 1945, military depots in the United States and Europe were overflowing with surplus weapons. In the UK, vast quantities of military gear were stockpiled in warehouses across the country. The British government quickly realized that even its most ambitious plans for reconstruction could not accommodate the overwhelming abundance of wartime machinery. The solution, at least in the short term, was simple: store it. But the cost of storage was also high. Warehouses, which were already in short supply due to the destruction of civilian infrastructure during the war, had to be converted into massive military storage facilities. Entirely new industries were established just to maintain these vast collections of armaments, an expensive and increasingly unsustainable effort. By late 1945, Britain, like many other nations, had transitioned from emergency wartime economics to peacetime austerity. The government's immediate response was to accelerate the sale of surplus materials to any buyers who could be found, including foreign governments. An arms surplus market emerged, though the demand for these weapons was limited. The nations of Europe, still struggling to recover, had little use for the tanks and artillery being offered. France, still recovering from the war, had no desire to further militarize its citizens. The Soviet Union, already a superpower in its own right, had little interest in accepting weapons that were now considered obsolete in light of its growing arms program. As a result, large quantities of surplus weaponry began to pile up in storage facilities, left to deteriorate under the weight of their own historical significance. The Americans, for their part, found themselves sitting on a staggering mountain of war material. It is estimated that at the war's end the U.S. had more than 2 million vehicles, many of which were still functional, piled in surplus, with no immediate use for them. Ships, too, were no exception. The U.S. Navy, which had expanded rapidly during the war, now found itself with a fleet far too large for the post-war era. The decision was made to mothball vast sections of the fleet, placing warships in inactive storage. These ships, once symbols of American power, sat rusting in harbors and shipyards, an expensive reminder of the war effort. The costs of maintaining these ships in reserve were astronomical. Keeping a warship on standby meant continued expenses for crews, supplies, and equipment. The scale of military surplus was difficult to comprehend. In addition to the massive piles of equipment, there was the sheer complexity of maintaining these supplies. Weapons that had been produced for combat, rifles, ammunition, explosives, began to rot in their crates, losing their utility even as they accumulated. By the time the war officially ended in 1945, tens of thousands of warplanes sat in fields and airstrips across the U.S., including the iconic B-17 Flying Fortress, many of which were never flown again. For a brief period, some of these aircraft found second lives in civilian aviation, as surplus was sold to private companies at deeply discounted rates. But the sheer volume of military aircraft remained a problem without an easy solution. Across the ocean in Europe, the picture was similarly grim. In the Soviet Union, too, there was an overwhelming abundance of military machinery. While the USSR was one of the victors of the war, its economic situation was fragile. The Soviet government faced the enormous task of rebuilding a country devastated by years of warfare, yet it could not afford to discard the enormous stocks of military equipment that had been produced during the conflict. Some of it, such as tanks and armored vehicles, was simply abandoned in warehouses, left to rot in the harsh Russian climate. Others were sent to scrap yards, where they were melted down for their metal, forever lost to history. At the same time, the Allies found themselves facing growing pressure from their own populations to return to civilian life. Veterans, many of whom had been in uniform for years, began to pour back into society, eager to rebuild their homes and families. The war effort, which had united millions of men and women across nations, was over, and the realities of peacetime started to settle in. Military bases, once bustling with activity, began to empty as soldiers returned home. The effort to demobilize armies created its own set of problems. Soldiers had to be decommissioned, equipment had to be sorted, and all the while, an army of bureaucrats tried to make sense of an unimaginable scale of material left behind. Still, the Allied nations were not prepared to simply discard all of this surplus. With the economy teetering, they knew that these materials might one day find a use again. The dilemma became, what was the most efficient way to rid themselves of the surplus without fully abandoning it? Military officials began looking for ways to repurpose the weapons, turning them into peaceful tools for reconstruction. But that effort was slow to gain traction, and the inevitable reality of disposal loomed large. In the United States, this meant that vast quantities of surplus material, some of which had been used in top-secret projects, began to be quietly destroyed, melted down, or buried in remote areas. In Britain, the process of selling surplus weapons to foreign nations continued, though at a much slower rate than initially anticipated. The aftermath of the war left much of the material produced during it to fade into obscurity. The Cold War was on the horizon, and the weapons that had been forged in the heat of conflict were slowly forgotten as nations focused their attention on new challenges and new arms races. The fate of these weapons was not always clear, and their ultimate disposal remained a source of both confusion and regret. What remained certain, however, was that they were no longer the symbols of victory they had once been. Instead, they were reminders of the immense cost of war and the strange, quiet end to a conflict that had reshaped the world. The fate of the massive stockpile of surplus weapons from World War II did not simply vanish into obscurity. Instead, it unfolded into a complex, often painful series of decisions driven by necessity, economics, and international diplomacy. The weapons, once essential to the war effort, were now symbols of an increasingly uneasy peace. As the years rolled on, the Allies were left with the challenge of figuring out how to handle their wartime legacy, sometimes destroying, sometimes repurposing, and sometimes selling to foreign nations. This was a process that stretched for years and, in some cases, decades after the war's end. The fate of these surplus weapons would shape the landscape of post-war economies and international relations in ways that remain felt today. In the immediate years following the war, some nations began to look at the surplus as a necessary evil. The cost of maintaining vast stockpiles of weaponry, many of which had become outdated in the new post-war military environment, was simply too great. In the United States, the government's focus shifted quickly from wartime production to peacetime consumer goods. The American economy, which had boomed during the war, now faced the challenge of a sudden peacetime conversion. With so many industries built to support the war effort, there was a pressing need to shift focus towards civilian production. The production of weapons and war materials would grind to a halt, and many manufacturing plants that had once been dedicated to the military were repurposed for consumer goods. Yet, the surplus remained. An overwhelming number of aircraft, tanks, artillery, and vehicles cluttered military depots across the U.S. The idea of scrapping or melting down these weapons seemed wasteful, especially since many of them could still be used. Yet, even keeping them in storage was a burden on the national economy. The government found itself in a paradox. To preserve these weapons meant spending money on storage, maintenance, and security. But to destroy them was to acknowledge the cost of the war effort in a very real way, and doing so risked making the tremendous military power that had been amassed during the war feel wasted, useless. Over time, some surplus materials were repurposed for civilian use. Aircraft like the B-17 Flying Fortress were sold off, not as military aircraft, but as cargo planes or even private airplanes. The planes that had once filled the skies during intense combat missions were now finding new life as a part of the civilian air transport industry. Similarly, jeeps and trucks found their way into civilian life, not just in the United States but also in Europe, as they were sold to countries rebuilding from the war. These vehicles, once symbols of wartime ingenuity, became the backbone of post-war economies. Still, the scale of this transformation was limited. While some surplus weapons found new purposes, much of the excess remained, stagnating in warehouses, abandoned fields, or rusting away in naval yards. Meanwhile, the United States, like the other Allied nations, began selling off surplus weapons to foreign countries. These sales were often motivated by political and economic considerations, rather than purely financial ones. Countries like Greece, Turkey, and even China found themselves buying American surplus weapons to bolster their defenses during a time when many nations were recovering from the war's devastation. The United States, eager to help stabilize these countries while keeping them within the Western sphere of influence, found that arms sales were a powerful tool of diplomacy. In some instances, these sales to foreign countries led to the proliferation of military technologies that were later used in conflicts far from the American shores. Yet, even as weapons were sold to foreign nations, they did not necessarily find long-term homes in active military service. Over time, many of these weapons became obsolete, and countries that had once relied on American surplus found themselves discarding them just as the Allies had done after the war. For the British, the surplus posed a different challenge. The United Kingdom, deeply in debt and struggling to recover from the war, found that maintaining stockpiles of weaponry was a luxury it could not afford. With no clear threat on the horizon, there was little need for massive military inventories. The British government faced enormous pressure to balance economic recovery with the maintenance of a military force that was, for the most part, no longer needed. The decision was made to sell off large quantities of surplus weapons, often to countries in the British Commonwealth or other former colonies. But as with the United States, the market for surplus weaponry was limited. Countries that had once relied on British arms found that newer, more advanced weapons were quickly replacing those they had purchased in the aftermath of the war. And so, much of the British surplus began to be quietly scrapped. In some cases, weapons were simply buried. Vast quantities of munitions were dumped in remote areas or sunk at sea, the metal and materials lost forever. the process of destruction was costly, and at times, the scale of it seemed almost obscene. The Allies had fought and sacrificed for years to amass this military might, and now they were left to discard it in an almost clinical way. But there was another reason for this quiet destruction. The sheer number of surplus weapons, and their potential for causing problems in the future, meant that leaving them intact was not a viable option. Thousands of tanks, jeeps, and aircraft were left to rot in fields, their engines silenced, their wheels stuck in the mud. These weapons had been produced in an era of urgency, but their post-war fate was marked by bureaucratic uncertainty and economic necessity. The Soviet Union, like the Western Allies, faced its own dilemma. While the USSR had emerged victorious from the war, it too was left with a vast inventory of surplus military hardware. The Soviet government, under Joseph Stalin's leadership, was focused on reconstruction and securing its borders, but the sheer scale of the Soviet military machine meant that much of the wartime armament was soon deemed surplus. With a growing arms race in the Cold War looming, the Soviet Union turned to the disposal of obsolete equipment. Much of it was scrapped, while some, including tanks and artillery, was left to rust in the harsh climate of Siberia. Unlike the Western Allies, the Soviets did not sell surplus military material to foreign nations on the same scale. Instead, much of the equipment languished as the USSR's attention turned toward expanding its nuclear and conventional military capabilities.